The following talk is offered freely to ensure that no one is ever denied access to these practices and to these teachings. If you feel inspired to make a donation to support this offering, you can go to my website at jonathanfoust.com. While you're there, you can also sign up for a monthly newsletter designed to support you in your practice. Thank you, and enjoy. So I have a dentist appointment on Thursday morning. Dr. Parikh is a saint, I think. She's a wonderful dentist, and her business is called Gentle Dental Care, which is why I chose her. But nonetheless, always a little trepidation. And it reminded me of this very short little joke. This guy walks into a dentist's office, and the dentist says, "Before we begin, would you like some helium?" The guy says, "Helium? Will it help with the pain?" The dentist says, "No, but when you scream, it sounds hilarious." So, part of the reason why I mentioned the dentist is that it sort of gives me the opportunity to explore a real fundamental teaching. And it's the parable of the second arrow. And you may be quite familiar with this. It's quite a kind of a common topic for Dharma talks. And it sort of reminded me how when you listen to different Dharma talks, after a while, as I like to say, you realize it's the same talk, But also, an interesting way to listen to talks, right? The first month-long retreat I went on, so there's a talk every night, and sometimes you're receptive, sometimes you're not, sometimes, it's like a really familiar topic, sometimes, it's not. But Gil Fronsdal, one of the senior teachers of Spirit Rock, said that part of the art of listening to a Dharma talk is sort of like, it's like taking a shower. Just sort of let it pour over you, and it never does any harm, but sometimes you can take in something here. But this parable of the second arrow really is a fundamental element of the practice, and it's the difference between reacting in the traditional ways you've always reacted and responding in a way that can deactivate ways that your conditioning comes into play. So the Buddha once asked the student, if a person is struck by an arrow, is it painful? And the student replied, yes, it is. And then the Buddha said, if a person is struck by a second arrow, is that even more painful? And the student replies, yes, it is. Then the Buddha explained, in life, we cannot always control the first arrow. However, the second arrow is our reaction to the first. And with the second arrow comes the possibility of choice. So this is very much about how you work with what is arising in your life. And how you relate is all part of your past conditioning. So I'd like to talk about how do you work this principle, the second arrow, in the physical body? It's kind of the primary area where you experience life. But also how you can apply this in the mental body, in your quality of thoughts, and also in the emotional body. And then to talk a little bit about how do we bring this forward in our life, in our practice, when we really look at kind of the roadmap of your life. How does this teaching come into play? So this morning I did an interview on a series that's going to be online next month on working with chronic pain. And just talking about it in this interview really kind of refreshed my appreciation of how when you have chronic and unrelenting pain, it is, at times, it's unbearable. It's exhausting, it's debilitating, it's depressing. Whenever you experience pain that goes on for a little while, you know the effect it has on you, just how draining it is and how hopeless it can have you feeling in a pretty short period of time. So quite often on longer retreats, physical pain comes up for a lot of people. And it becomes a real opportunity to really work with your relationship with the pain. You have nothing else to do, so there it is when you're on a retreat. So there was someone who was dealing with a lot of back and neck pain that was showing up in her meditation, and we had an interview to kind of explore it, and she said, "I have to leave. This is too much. It's unbearable." And we talk a lot about this acronym of RAIN in this practice. First to recognize or realize what's happening. The second, the A, to ask if you can allow it or accept it. And here it's always important to recognize that sometimes you can't. Sometimes it's too much. And so when you get flooded or you get overwhelmed by the unpleasantness of any experience, whether it be physical, mental, or emotional, then it's really helpful to shift your attention in some way. But sometimes just by asking the question, can I allow this? Sometimes it opens up a little more room. And that allows you to explore the I of that acronym, which is to investigate, to really lean in and look closer at what is arising. Then the N is to nourish what you find with empathy or kindness or compassion. Quite often that formula is a real formula for transforming something that feels really stuck. And so part of her panic, I need to leave, I can't take this, was kind of a classic reaction to physical pain. It's too much and we want out. We really desperately want out. And so when you're in that chronic physical pain, it's a very deep clench, a very deep grip. There's an interesting teaching where someone said that when you go into a clench in life, quite often it'll have one of three major flavors. One is it'll be in some way tied into survival. You'll feel like your life is threatened or your identity is threatened. Or that clench can be tied into a fear of losing control, because the pain or the emotion can be so strong, you've got no control over it. Or it might be related in some way to losing affection or attention or love. So when we get overwhelmed, either we get very agitated, we go into fight, anger, judgment, blame, aggression, or we go into flight, we disassociate. We'll go into planning or fantasy or anywhere but here. Or we'll lock up, we go into paralysis. And so for her, the pain was really overwhelming. But when I asked her, can you be with it? She said, yeah, I can kind of be with it for a little while. So we began to explore, well, what was the first arrow? Was, like the back spasms and the chronic pain in her neck and the kind of the flickering ghost pain, all around her spine. But then we talked about the second arrow. What was she adding to it? And so she began to kind of explore. And she had this belief, like, I'm going to be a cripple. And then she remembered seeing her grandparents as they got old and when they were crippled and in really, really chronic pain, and how helpless they were and how helpless she was, and seeing them, and all this emotional memory came to the surface. And as she explored this more, really going into her experience was really feeling like this is never going to go away. So that was her story that she was adding to it. So I asked her if she could move from the story to the actual experience. So I asked her to close her eyes and to try to tell me what she was feeling in a way that I could recreate the same sensations. And so she closed her eyes and she was sort of describing, I feel a stabbing sensation on the right side of my lower back. And now I feel it flaring up into my mid-back. Between my shoulder blades is a burning sensation. And now it feels like it's hotter and it's growing. And then later she said, no, well, now it's getting a little smaller. And then she was aware of a little bit of calm. And then I can feel a flickering on the left side of my hip. And she began to describe this moment-to-moment experience of sensation without a story. Very challenging practice to be present without adding anything to it. And you know, if you've had chronic pain, how quickly we go into a grip. There's a classic story of a monk who was dying, and his body was literally kind of like falling apart. And yet some monks went to visit him in his little kuti, in his hut, and he just had this glowing radiance about him. And a lot of the monks came to visit him, and they said, what is your practice? Because it was so clear that his body was decomposing in front of their eyes. And yet he had this blazing sense of presence. I said, what is your practice? And he said, I keep my awareness in the body in and of itself, putting away fear, greed, and concern for the world. So he was able to stay with the first arrow without adding any story, without adding any narrative to it whatsoever. This is really easy to talk about. It's not so easy to practice when at least for me, when I'm caught in that grip. You know, pain is exhausting, it's terrifying. It creates horrible stories in your head. But the interesting thing is, what I've found is that pain is also a teacher. There's something that is being communicated to me. I may have no idea what it is. Sometimes it's purely biological. Sometimes it has some psycho-emotional component to it. But the question is, can you move away from your reaction to the sensation to actually being intimately in relationship with it? A little trick for me when I begin to feel a cold coming on, like a cold or a flu, and you know, when you can sort of feel the kind of the heaviness and the, you know, all the sensations, is I always noticed I would go into the second arrow. Oh my God, tomorrow's going to be a nightmare. What am I going to do? I've overcommitted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Am I the only one? But what I do now is when I feel a cold coming on, I'll kind of like get in touch with it, and then I'll ask it, and I'll say, if I treat you right now as if you're at its most chronic, can we move this thing through a little more quickly? And not all the time, but some of the time I get kind of a, yeah. You know, so then I'll hydrate and I'll take a shower and I'll go to bed early and I'll do all the things I would as if I was like in a full-blown thing, and then I'll feel great the next day. So part of that for me has been, can I really lean in with a direct experience rather than get hijacked by the second and the third and the fourth arrow that I add to my experience? The other antidote to pain, of course, is compassion. There's a little reading I thought I'd share with you. Muhammad went to visit a sick friend. Such kindness brings more kindness. And there's no knowing of the proliferation from there. The man was about to die. Muhammad put his face close and kissed him. His friend began to revive. Muhammad's visit recreated him. He began to feel grateful for an illness that brought such light, and also for the back pain that wakes him in the night. No need to snore like a buffalo when this wonder is walking the world. There are values in pain that are difficult to see without the presence of a guest. Don't complain about autumn. Walk with grief like a good friend. Listen to what he says. Sometimes the cold and dark of a cave give the opening we most want. So it's very much about moving away from our hallucinations about our experience to the direct experience as it's happening. Not that you don't do something about alleviating pain, of course, but when it arises, can you respond to it in a skillful way rather than a fearful way? So that's a little bit about the physical body. And of course, everything arises from the physical body. Emotions and thoughts are directly related. So we can always translate an emotion, finding it on the inside. But of course, much of what we experience is mental. It's our thoughts and how we react to life. And recently, I was in conversation and an exploration with a woman who was coming to recognize that she was coming to the end of her relationship. She had really worked it for years. They'd struggled. They both tried to make it work for their children. And her strategy was to ignore it. Pretend that everything was okay, that they were going to get through it, but it became more and more chronic. Her husband was constantly critical and really agitated with her. And she knew it wasn't just him. She knew it was a two-way street. She had a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety, and that sort of held her back, and she would get needy, and he'd get progressively irritated with her. And it had recently come to a head when he had criticized her publicly at a party. Somehow they just got into some bickering, and then he kind of lashed out at her in front of their friends. And she was embarrassed and kind of humiliated. So, of course, you can imagine the second arrow that she was adding to this. Her fear, her anxiety, the churning that she was holding about this. And I asked her, well, what are you believing about yourself right now? And immediately she said, I'm a failure. I've always been a failure, and this is never going to change. So again, we sort of turned our attention to this second arrow. The first area was her sort of grief and the humiliation that she felt. But what was she adding to it? And as she sort of realized and talked about her husband and his ongoing criticism and his irritation with her, and pretty quickly she realized that was pretty related to her primary household where she grew up. Her father was very judgmental and very withholding. And her mother, when her father would sort of go on these attacks, would just disappear. She would just leave the scene. And so she realized that the anxiety and the fear and the sense of being a failure was not a new feeling. It was something that she'd been carrying for a very, very long time. And so we explored that, and again, sort of moving from the story and where she felt it in the inside, and she could really feel that deep, very, very old place inside where she was holding this very, very deep sense of humiliation. And then she just opened her eyes and she said, I'm doing the same thing with my daughters. And that began to shift something for her. She began to see the possibility that if she could change, the effect it would have on her kids. What happens so often is that when we experience some wounding of some kind, we just spin it in our heads. We just keep turning it over and over and over and over again without any resolution whatsoever. So I thought I'd read to you. And this is in like almost excruciating detail of how the Buddha talked about this sort of mental agitation we go into. So this is the translation here. It's just as if someone were wounded with an arrow thickly smeared with poison. His friends and companions, kinsmen and relatives would provide him with a surgeon, and the man would say, I won't have this arrow removed until I know whether the man who wounded me was a noble warrior, a priest, a merchant, or a worker. He would say, I won't have this arrow removed until I know the given name and the clan name of the man who wounded me, until I know whether he was tall, medium, or short, until I know whether he was dark, ruddy brown, or golden colored, until I know his home village, town, or city, until I know whether the bow in which I was wounded was a long bow or a crossbow, until I know whether the bowstring with which I was wounded was fiber, bamboo threads, sinew, hemp, or bark. We're only halfway through. And it goes on and on and on. And this is so much a part of how our mind works. Rather than attending to the wound directly, we stay in a superficial analysis. And there's never a resolution. It is utterly natural to recoil from pain. We're just designed to move away from pain and move toward pleasure. But it takes courage to actually turn and face the wound when it's there. So, in another meeting with this woman, just in acknowledging sort of the humiliation that she was feeling and the desperation she was feeling, she kind of replayed this whole thing of, as a kid, just being constantly berated by her father and her mother just disappearing and not being there for her. And as you can imagine, she began to tap into recognizing a really deep sense of anger and resentment. So when we experience an arrow that hits the emotional body, again, that's where we tend to spend more time on the second and the third arrow, or the analysis around it, rather than the willingness to actually feel the wound of the first arrow itself. So when she began to recognize that she was feeling anger, she moved into kind of the classic reaction, which I know really, really well, which is to get very afraid of the anger. Because normally we're afraid of what we're going to do if we really let it out. The damage we might do to someone else, or the damage we might do to others. And so we explored something which was very, very helpful, particularly in a meditation practice when you are presented with anger, when you turn from the second arrow to the first arrow, only when the conditions feel right, is to really locate it inside, to really come in intimate contact with the really deep wounding, the really deep pain of it, and then to investigate it. And part of that investigation is giving it permission to get big. So as she was locating this anger inside, I asked her, how big could it get? And in a voice I'd never heard her say before, she's a very sweet person, she said, "It could burn this place down." And so I encouraged her to let it do that. And again, when she gave that anger permission to get big, it got bigger than the room, it got bigger than the building, it just free range. And in letting it get big, she could then sense all the other pieces that made up that anger, of the very, very deep hurt, a very deep disappointment, a very deep sense of kind of like chronic shame that now had room to be seen and felt and named. And over time, as she continued to sense it and name it and feel it, she began to feel more free. She began to sense some possibilities. And again, she sort of revisited the sense of a completely different relationship with her daughters and the possibility of a different relationship with her husband. There's an interesting, I've told this story before, but when we keep turning away from the first arrow and we focus more on the second and third and fourth arrow. This story is the story of someone who went to a very, very wise healer and you had to walk days to go and visit him. And when you finally got to his little hut, he would say, "You have to promise you won't tell anyone." Of course, someone did, or I wouldn't be telling you this story. I'm going to ask you one question. What are you not willing to feel? And then people would spend the next 4 or 5 days walking back to civilization, contemplating that. And that is a really courageous question to ask. What are you not willing to feel? And what you're not willing to feel is all part of the mechanism of the second arrow. And particularly when it comes to anger, the Buddha said this about the importance of investigating and letting go of anger. He said, "He abused me and beat me. He threw me down and robbed me. Repeat these thoughts and you live in hate. He abused me and beat me. He threw me down and robbed me. Abandon these thoughts and live in love. In this world, hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone is healed. This is the ancient and eternal law." So this becomes a very powerful teaching when we broaden it out to the world we're living in now, where there is so much agitation and so much hatred and so much polarization. The recognition that hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone. And this is the ancient and eternal law. And the only way we can begin is by ourselves. And for me, as I am so, at times, kind of hopelessly reactive to the news headlines, is it possible for me to not add more agitation to what I'm feeling? To not want to react and lash out as others are lashing out? That becomes a very rich practice. So in the Buddha's times, there were a lot of philosophers and a lot of arguments about the nature of reality. And, such as, is there a self? Is there not a self? What is the nature of infinity? And a lot of these philosophers were very eager to engage with the Buddha. He was considered a really, really powerful teaching. And they really wanted to kind of get down into these philosophical debates. And he brought in the second arrow teaching here. And Thich Nhat Hanh has a little writing on this I'll share. The Buddha always told his disciples not to waste their time and energy in metaphysical speculation. Whenever he was asked a metaphysical question, he remained silent. Instead, he directed his disciples toward practical efforts. Questioned one day about the problem of infinity in the world, the Buddha said, whether the world is finite or infinite, limited or unlimited, the problem of your liberation remains the same. And this, he talked again about the second arrow. If a man is struck by a poison arrow, the doctor wishes to take it out immediately. And the man does not want to remove until he knows who shot it, his age, his parents, and why he shot it. What would happen? If he were to wait until all those questions would have been answered, the man might have died first. Life is short, he said. It must not be spent in endless metaphysical speculation that does not bring us any closer to the truth. So then what is the practice? And the practice really comes down to something really pragmatic. Can you be present right now and right here without adding a second arrow? What does it mean to be present without adding a story or a narrative? And in relationship with other people. Can you be present for other people without adding a second arrow? In many Buddhist circles, there's a line where people say, hey, don't you second arrow me. Becomes kind of a mantra. So let's take a few moments just to practice. So you might like to close your eyes. And slow down your breath. And just take a moment to really notice what is present. And you might explore if you were to again bring in a point of concentration, perhaps to bring your attention to the movement of the breath inside. Or to open your attention to the sounds around you, or the sense of pulse or tingling inside the hands. Is it possible if just for the next minute simply to feel and experience what is right here without adding any particular story to it? there is a quality that inevitably arises as you pay attention on purpose. A quality of non-judging awareness, where you become the observer of everything that is changing. And this quality of self-observation without judgment is a doorway to move from a life of reactivity to what Deepak Chopra calls the field of infinite possibility. In these final moments, you might bring into mind someone you know who is struggling now. Someone who may feel caught or reacting. Someone for whom they may be feeling a second or third arrow about their life struggle. And you might take a few moments to wish them well, wish them ease. And you might broaden this out to our culture right now that is so polarized and reactive and blaming and judging. And in your own way to wish all beings ease. May all feel a deeper sense of peace, and may all feel free. And as you're ready, you can begin to deepen your breath. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. Becoming more sensitive to the second arrow is not only something you can practice for yourself, just to notice when you're adding to any moment of unpleasantness, but as a relational tool as well, to really observe how you respond, how you react to others, whether it might be exacerbating a situation or perhaps offering something helpful or kind. I always find it helpful when I remember the acronym when I'm in conversation, the acronym WAIT. If you're not familiar with that, why am I talking? Just that can open up all kinds of new possibilities. So thank you so much for your attention tonight. Thank you for coming out. I believe I saw the cookie cart going by. Also, I just want to thank you for your support for the class and for the church. And if you'd like to be on the mailing list, you can sign up in the back. Enjoy all the arrows as they come in your direction. Thank you.